Chicago, the Windy City, the only city in America completely rebuilt from the bottom up. Today it is a popular tourist destination, but there was a time when Chicago was home to a turbulent social movement that would change history forever. Chicago was a location in the freedom movement.
Before the Civil Rights Movement began, the inequality of African Americans has been an issue, which is why groups of people have founded associations to try and achieve equality. In 1909, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, was founded in New York City. A group of white intellectuals, the leaders, sought to make whites aware for the need of racial equality. The group launched a program of making speeches, lobbying, and publicizing the issue. The group also started a magazine, The Crisis. The NAACP worked through the court cases of inequality. They announced plans for their movement in which they targeted their civil rights and the inequality of African Americans were experiencing at the time. In August of 1919, a young black boy had drowned on the white side of a beach, crossing that invisible race line which started the race riot. After the riot, a total of over 500 people were injured. The plans for the 1960s Chicago Freedom Movement was started on January 7, 1966 by Martin Luther King and the Southern Christian leadership. The groundwork began for the Freedom Movement in the summer of 1965. In July, the leaders of the Freedom Movement invited MLK to lead the demonstrations against segregation in education, housing, and employment.
The majority of the Chicago Freedom Movement happened from mid-1965 to early 1967, almost 2 years. The main leaders of the movement were Martin Luther King Jr. and Al Raby. The leaders helped stage protests and demonstrations against segregation in education, housing, and employment. According to the government and society, business owners had the right to deny colored people in certain education, apartments and houses in white neighborhoods, and jobs that they were perfectly qualified for just because they were a different color. One of the largest protests was held in 1966, what was meant to be a peaceful march through a white neighborhood. It led to massive race riots all over the city. During the march, protesters were being called racial slurs and having bottles and bricks hurled at them. These events led to huge race riots, and both black and white citizens were injured or killed.
The Chicago Freedom Movement had some lasting effects. For example, it brought national focus to the civil rights struggle. This was significant because it created a bigger support system and allowed peaceful protests to happen elsewhere in the U.S. Ultimately, increased participation in the civil rights movement brought it to a sooner conclusion. As a result of the Chicago Freedom Movement, public housing and mortgages in Chicago became available to people regardless of race. After the movement, King wrote "Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community" as a commentary on what happened and to highlight some of the issues that still needed to be addressed. Perhaps most importantly, the Summit Agreement was signed, which called for measures to strengthen the enforcement of existing laws and regulations with respect to housing.
The civil rights fight was far from over, but because of the works of King and Raby in the Chicago Freedom Movement, things were beginning to improve. Fast forward to present, Chicago is still struggling to provide adequate housing and equal rights to the citizens of its city.
When people think of homelessness, they typically think dirty, hopeless adults and bums on the streets. But in Chicago, a large part of the homeless population is children. In fact, the fastest growing group in homelessness is families comprised of single parents and children. The average age of a homeless child in Chicago is 9 years old. Also worth mentioning is the fact that in Chicago today, 98.1% of the homeless children are people of color. This overwhelming majority suggests that even today, race issues are afoot. However, in the 1960s, white males made up the majority of the homeless population, which can be explained by the fact that African Americans made up less than 10% of the population, as compared to the 42% of today.
Many Chicago renters still feel that they are overburdened by the price of renting where they would like to live. The overpricing of rent results in many more children being homeless that could be housed. Many people also claim that low wages are an issue. They work almost constantly and still cannot afford to pay rent, putting more children on the streets. 50% of renters feel that they are overburdened. Some can't even find jobs. The current unemployment rate in Chicago is 10.2%. Nearly 90,000 Illinoisans working full-time year-round fall below the poverty line. Many low-income renters can't afford to live where they work.
"97% of homeless children in Chicago move up to 3 times in a year. They go hungry at least twice the rate of other children, have 3 times the rate of emotional and behavioral problems such as anxiety, depression, sleep problems, and aggression. 40% attend 2 different schools in a year, and 28% attend 3 or more different schools. A large percent of homeless children in Chicago have a higher chance of decay in development and twice as likely of learning disabilities. They're 16% less proficient at reading and math than their peers. 1/3, usually repeated grade, have little or no positive interaction with adults.
Civil rights have been an issue for a long time. In the 1960s, inequalities were expressed in the Chicago Freedom Movement. The movement worked to help with housing, education, and employment discrimination. In Martin Luther King Jr.'s book, he asked the question, chaos or community? And because of the homeless children population in Chicago today, our answer is chaos.